Hey, welcome back to Well, That's Interesting. The Thanks for That, It Explains a Lot edition. Today is a bonus. The call is coming from inside the house. What horror films teach us about us. My friends, would you look at the date? We are dead smack in the middle of spooky season, no pun intended, and I have got a treat for you. Okay, I can see your reaction from here. You're probably thinking, especially if you're a long-time listener of the show, you're probably thinking, oh dear God, this podcast already scares the ever-living Jeebus out of me some weeks. What are you going to share with us now? Well, if you're thinking that, one, thank you, I'll take that as a compliment, and two, I'm going to share a pair of TED Talks that explains the seemingly unexplainable. Why in the holy hell do some people enjoy watching horror movies? This may or may not come as a surprise, but your favorite podcast host, well, me, of course, I adore this genre. As a child and into my teens, I grew up watching the classics, like Poltergeist, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Shining, The Thing, The Fly, Silence of the Lambs, you name a film that a preteen shouldn't watch, and I totally saw it. And hey, look, don't judge. I was raised by a single mom in the 80s. She was doing her best. And honestly, it was the perfect upbringing. I continued watching horror into my adulthood, and as I grew, so did the genre. As I matured, I noticed horror became really complex. Or maybe, just maybe, it was always that way. If you're a fan, then you may agree there's more under the bloody surface. And today, I have TED Talks that put that more into words. In the first half of the show, lessons from a terrified horror researcher. Yes, that's the title of the TED Talk, and I can't wait to share it. Recorded back in ye olde 2017, Matthias Klassen, a specialist in horror media, took to the stage after spending years, quote, getting to the bottom of the paradox of horror. Why do people seek out the kind of entertainment that's designed to make them feel bad? End quote from TED.com. Well, my friends, drawing from his research on human cognition and evolution, Matthias believes horror prepares us for real-world threats by testing our emotional resilience. It helps us to evolve our fear system, subtly teaching us to manage and master our most primal emotions. As he so wonderfully put it, quote, horror lets us learn what it feels like to be truly afraid, and it lets us learn how to handle negative emotions. It lets us maintain and refine coping skills that we may apply in critical situations in our own lives. There isn't much experimental research into this, but we do have some support from psychological science. One study suggests that hardcore horror fans require more extreme stimulation than do less avid fans, which means that the hardcore fans build up some resistance to fear-provoking stimuli with exposure. Other research suggests that by exposing ourselves to horror, we build a sense of mastery, which may be transferred into our own lives. In this way, horror can help us find and even expand our limits for how much negative stimulation we can handle. I'm not sure I'd be standing here today if I hadn't forced myself to watch all those horror films in the name of science. Sure, my heart is hammering and my palms are a little sweaty, but you guys are a lot less scary than Pennywise the Dancing Clown. So horror can help us calibrate the fear system, and horror can help us refine our coping skills. End quote. So, horror is educational. I knew it. Then after the break, we're diving deeper with Dr. Steve Schlossman, an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital. He's authored more than 40 academic publications, helped design video games that teach adolescents about neurobiology, and collaborated with other wonderful nerds at King's College London to assess attitudes regarding psychiatry among medical educators and curricula. Hold on, there's more. He teaches horror at Harvard, is the author of The Zombie Autopsies, and writes for up-and-coming news outlets like The Huffington Post, The New York Times, Psychology Today, NBC, CNN, ABC, Newsweek, and The Guardian. Today, Dr. Steve is going to hold up a mirror and we're going to ask some questions. Questions that may be very uncomfortable to ask, all to get to know ourselves better and form community. The talk is aptly called What Horror Films Teach Us About Ourselves and Being Human. And he's going to share the science behind the answers. In the meantime, hi, I'm Jill Chacha, And if this is your first time listening, welcome to the flock, my terrified business goose. Up first is Matthias Klassen.
I really don't like to watch horror films alone. That stuff is terrifying, you know? I'm sure many of you recognize this situation. You put on a horror film, you turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and sit back. You're watching as monsters come creeping out of the dark in search of prey. Your heart goes out to the poor characters in the film, and you start squirming in your seat as the monsters get closer. Your pulse accelerates. Your palms get sweaty, and your hair stands on end. This is when you begin to throw nervous glances into the corners of the room. What was that sound? Surely it didn't come from the television. Was that movement in the shadows? The horror that's on the screen bleeds into your system and into the surroundings. The world around you turns threatening and scary. You cover your eyes, but it doesn't help. Pretty soon you'll have to switch off, but even though you shut off the film, your heart keeps hammering away. You'll probably have nightmares tonight. Still, maybe you ought to put the film back on. You are kind of curious after all. That's my Saturday night in a nutshell. Anybody else ever been in that situation? Of all the strange things that humans do, watching horror films has got to be one of the strangest. It's also a really interesting behavior, scientifically speaking. As a horror researcher, I've thought about it a lot. Why do we do it? Why do we watch horror films and read horror novels and play horror video games? And why are there so many spooky creatures in our worlds of make-believe? And what is horror? Horror is a kind of entertainment that's designed to spook people, to make them scream and shiver with fear and break out in a cold sweat. Think Stephen King and Paranormal Activity and The Exorcist. It's a consistently popular and profitable genre. Stephen King has sold more than 350 million books worldwide. In the last 20 years in the United States, horror films grossed close to $8 billion. It's weird. It's weird because horror is by definition designed to make its audience feel bad. A good horror film inspires negative emotion. It makes us feel disgust and dread and terror and anxiety and fear. Let me ask you, how many of you seek out horror films from time to time? Show of hands, please. Raise your hand if you sometimes seek out horror. Okay, that's about half. That matches my own research. Along with some colleagues, I'm looking into the personality profile of horror fans. And we're finding that more than half, or about 54%, answer in the affirmative in response to the statement, "I tend to enjoy horror media." Only 29% say they don't agree with this statement, and the remaining 17% can't make up their mind. You know, they're probably the ones who would die first in a horror film. Next would be the ones who say they don't like horror. Anyway, people really do tend to like the kind of entertainment that's designed to make them feel bad. Why is that the case, and how does horror even work? Those are the kinds of questions I've been researching, and here is what I have found out. Horror, in whatever medium, from films and literature to video games and virtual reality, works by exploiting an ancient and evolved set of biological defense mechanisms. Let's call it the evolved fear system. If we want to understand how that system works and why it became part of human nature, we have to look at the evolutionary history of our species. Now, our evolutionary ancestors found themselves in a world that was full of danger. There was the threat from predators and creepy crawlies and invisible microorganisms or disease, and the threat from other humans. In response to those dangers, our ancestors gradually evolved a fear system that would keep them alert and alive. In other words, our species evolved to be hypervigilant and highly fearful, because being hypervigilant and highly fearful kept our ancestors alive in a dangerous world. The world may now be less dangerous than it was in ancestral times, at least in terms of predation. We're not in any immediate danger of being attacked by a saber-toothed cat on our way home from work, but we are no less vigilant and no less fearful than our evolutionary ancestors. And horror entertainment takes advantage of that aspect of human nature. So, horror entertainment works by transporting us imaginatively into virtual worlds that are full of danger. In horror films and literature, we follow and mirror protagonists as they confront terrifying threats. Take Stephen King's The Shining, for example. Here we follow a family who is snowed in at a haunted hotel. In the novel's most famous scene, the young boy, Danny, goes into room 217. He walks nervously around the room and into the bathroom where a hotel guest killed herself some years before. The hotel is now supposed to be empty of guests, but to Danny's surprise, there is somebody in the bathtub, or something. To Danny's horror, it's a corpse. It's the corpse of the woman who killed herself. She's lying there, bloated and purple and with glassy white eyes. She's rotting like meat festering in the trash. And then she starts to get up. King provides a detailed and really vivid description of this moving corpse. And as readers, we are forced to hold that image in our minds. That's bad enough. But we're also given a detailed description of Danny's response to the situation. We learn that he tries to scream and wets himself. We are made to mirror his fear and revulsion, and that strengthens our own responses to the horrible image. Our fear and revulsion become mixed with sympathetic anxiety for a character in danger. It's a strong emotional cocktail. Interactive and live-action media turn the screw on horror entertainment. Horror video games, for example, make you feel as if you're the protagonist in a digital world populated by monsters. In a haunted attraction, visitors walk through scary sets populated by scare actors. Here's a picture from Dystopia Haunted House, Denmark's scariest haunt. What you see is a couple of visitors who are confronted by a big guy with a machete. He's called Le Chef, and you can take a guess at what's on the menu here. Around 5,000 people pay for this every Halloween, and around 300 visitors never make it all the way through the haunt. They have to abort their visit because it's too scary. They have fainted from fear, and they have wet themselves in terror. Why do they do it? Why do people pay good money to experience true fear and genuine terror, like the people in this picture? They do it because they have an evolved appetite for vicarious experience with threat scenarios. And those scenarios, our horror entertainment, work because they are structured to target the evolved fear system. Just consider the monsters that populate our horror entertainment, from scary folk tales to haunted attractions. Such monsters are universal in the human imagination, and the most horrifying ones reflect ancestral threats. Just think of the enormous white shark from Jaws, doo-doo, doo-doo, doo-doo. The threat depicted here is the threat from an enormous man-eating predator. That kind of threat really captures our attention and sparks our imagination by engaging the evolved fear system. Now, the film itself is pretty unrealistic, but that doesn't matter. Horror monsters don't have to be realistic to frighten us. They have to engage the evolved fear system. They have to have qualities that match or overmatch those of ancestral dangers. And the white shark in Jaws has that in spades. It's like an ancestral predator on speed. Faster, bigger, stronger, and much more dangerous. Media psychologists have documented how thousands of people were traumatized by Jaws. Many viewers even became afraid of swimming in pools and freshwater lakes after watching the film. Consider another well-known and highly unrealistic monster, the zombie. Now, zombies don't exist in the real world, and we have no archaeological evidence to suggest that they ever did. But every well-raised child is able to mimic the behavior of a zombie. The groaning, the outstretched but limp arms, and the classic stumbling walk. The monster has really infected our popular culture in a big way. A zombie is a terrifying concept because it effectively targets the evolved fear system. In fact, the zombie targets the fear system from two angles because it combines the threat of predation with the threat of contagion. A zombie is a predator. It wants to eat you. It is also contagious. It will infect you with its disease. It is visibly decomposing, creeping with rotten pathogens. I mean, look at the poor creature. You can tell that these horror monsters engage the evolved fear system from the behavioral and physiological effects of a good horror film. You know, the goosebumps and the hammering heart and the screams. These are all evolved defensive reactions. Goosebumps are a relic from a distant past when we were covered in fur. And goosebumps, or piloerection, would make our fur stand on end and so make us look bigger to scare off an attacker. Cats do the same thing, by the way. Our hearts beat faster to pump blood to the big muscle groups so that we're ready for fight or flight. And screams send a signal to other people, a signal for them to help or get the hell away. Horror taps into the evolved fear system, but that's not all. Horror can help us calibrate that system. It's like when you take your car to the mechanic for a checkup. The mechanic carefully goes through all the vital parts of the car, and he or she will make sure that the airbags and the anti-lock braking system work. Hopefully you'll never need them, because you don't want to get into a situation that requires an airbag to deploy. But you certainly want them to work. Same with the fear system. Through exposure to horror, you give it a test run, make sure it works properly, and keep it nicely tuned. Horror lets us learn what it feels like to be truly afraid. And it lets us learn how to handle negative emotions. It lets us maintain and refine coping skills that we may apply in critical situations in our own lives. There isn't yet much experimental research into this, but we do have some support from psychological science. One study suggests that hardcore horror fans require more extreme stimulation than do less avid fans, which means that the hardcore fans build up some resistance to fear-provoking stimuli with exposure. Other research suggests that by exposing ourselves to horror, we build a sense of mastery, which may be transferred to our own lives. In this way, horror can help us find and even expand our limits for how much negative stimulation we can handle. You know, I'm not sure I'd be standing here today if I hadn't forced myself to watch all those horror films in the name of science. Sure, my heart is hammering and my palms are a little sweaty, but you guys are a lot less scary than Pennywise, the dancing clown. So, horror can help us calibrate the fear system, and horror can help us refine our coping skills. That's why so many of us are drawn to the genre, even if we don't like to watch horror films alone. The next time you're terrified of a novel, a film, a video game, or in a haunt, just remember that you are, in fact, tapping into and calibrating an ancient biological defense system. Never mind the fear and the screams and the nightmares. Who's up for a horror film tonight? Thank you.
Well, there you have it, my prepared business goose. It's all, it's all worth it. After the break, Dr. Steve is going to take the stage and show us who we really are in his TED Talk titled, What Horror Films Teach Us About Ourselves and Being Human. It's going to cover cognitive dissonance and prejudice, like the worst humanity has to offer, and you're going to laugh. Horror Explained continues, so please, stay tuned.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and LifeLock has tips to protect your identity. Use strong passwords, set up multi-factor authentication, report phishing, and update the software on your devices. And for comprehensive identity protection, let LifeLock alert you to suspicious uses of your personal information. LifeLock also fixes identity theft, guaranteed or your money back. Stay smart, safe, and protected with a 30-day free trial at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Purina believes no one should have to make the impossible choice between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Through the Purple Leash Project, Purina is helping create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
And we're back. We are so back. And my friends, we're about to meet Dr. Steven Schlossman, whose talk opens up with a banger, the drawing of Nosferatu's face. This is the creature from the 1922 silent German expressionist vampire film, and he says this isn't a drawing at all. This is a representation of us. And it's a good thing. Let's get into it, shall we? What horror films teach us about ourselves and being human. Here we go.
Wow. A standing ovation. I haven't done anything yet. Don't hardly feel right, as they say. Okay. Sorry, this is your last thing, right? This is what you're going to look at. That behind you, that's a mirror, okay? That's a mirror of all of you. I'm not trying to be insulting. It's just true. And it's a mirror of me. It's a mirror of pretty much anybody who looks at it except the guy in the picture, because we know he doesn't show up on film, right? We know that's how it works. But it's okay that that's a mirror, because if it were more pristine, if it were more kind of accurate, I think it'd be hard to look at. This is what I'm going to try and tell you about horror. It teaches us about ourselves. It actually entertains us and helps us to love each other even more. And I know that sounds like a cliche, so you're going to have to bear with me for a little bit, and you're going to have to bear with me as I tell you some stories. So let's get started. That's me as just bangs make the difference. When I was 11 years old, with bangs, I saw a vampire. I did. He was someone's brother, this vampire, and he was hovering outside this second-story window through which he was trying to gain access, and his nails, they'd grown unnaturally long throughout the night. He was staring at me with these kind of lifeless, glowing, yellow, bile-filled eyes, and you know what? I let that vampire into the house. Now, I've been thinking about that vampire for a long, long time. He was scratching at the window, and he was smiling. So, if I could play you this scene, which we can't because of copyright reasons, but that's good, because the music alone would scare the hell out of me again, and I'd be back at that time when I had bangs. So rather than to do that, what I'd like to do for you is paint the picture. I'd like to take you back. So like I said, I was 11 years old, it's 1978. You need to picture a wood-paneled basement, okay? And I'm home all alone. It's just me and my trusty dog Patches, who is this mongrel, this white mongrel animal whose white fur kind of blended seamlessly with the white shag carpet. My parents were out for the evening. My sister is having a sleepover at someone's house, and I've eaten all but the last piece of one of those God-given Tostino frozen pizzas. Those are like the greatest gift ever to frozen food. And I'm clutching in one of those 70s plastic translucent cups, which you've seen, which you probably still have in your basement. I'm clutching a glass of Dr. Pepper, and there's a vampire at the window. So I tell you what, you know what I did? I got up and I ran up the stairs and I turned on every light in the house. Every light went on, and I didn't care that I had little bits of pizza crumbs stuck to my flannel shirt, and I didn't care that my dog was running after me going, "What's going on, Steve? What's all the fuss?" I didn't care that I was pretty sure I knocked over that Dr. Pepper thing down below. None of that mattered to me. What mattered was that there was a vampire at the window in the basement. So I had to do something. I had to take action. My dad was a doctor, so I went into the bathroom and I found all these tongue depressors. And then I found these rubber bands and I made them into crosses. I made like 12 crosses out of rubber bands. I did this. But you know what the funniest part of all this is? I'm Jewish. I'd never made a cross in my life, but I knew the rules. There was a vampire in the basement and I wasn't taking any chances. So that vampire, those of you who may have recognized him, that was from the made-for-TV movie Salem Slot. That was on network television. I don't know how they got that one passed. network television, if you talk to people from my generation and you say, what was the scariest movie you've ever seen? They'll go through the canon. They'll say the Amityville Horror, The Exorcist, The Omen. And then you say, did you ever see Salem's Lot? And their eyes will grow wide and they'll get this big smile like, oh my God, yeah, that movie scared me to death. Directed by the same guy who directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But I will bet you 1,000 tickets to 1,000 horror conventions that if they tell you their story about Salem's Lot, it'll be a lot like the story I just told you. It might not involve Tostino's frozen pizza. It might involve like a bag of Doritos instead. It might involve a sleepover, but nobody sleeps over, right? Everyone's up all night in this delightful terror after having seen this show. And this is what horror does. Horror grabs you when you're 11 years old, which, by the way, is the average age when people see their first horror film. It's 11, so there's something transgressive about horror. It grabs you and it makes some of the most loyal fans on the planet. Even bad horror films make money. But don't get me wrong, there are plenty of really, really good horror films. Films that are celebrated by the critics and the fans alike. Let's wander through them. The Shining. Who has not had nightmares about those twins in the hallway? That little kid with his red rum thing and the bike and the elevator. The Shining. There's Rosemary's Baby. 1968. I teach this film to Harvard undergraduates. They've grown up with YouTube, right? They need the story to begin, middle, and end by 3 minutes, and they sit through 2+ hours of Rosemary's descent into hell. And they have this huge smile on their face, and they say, why don't we see movies like this anymore? There's It Follows, a movie that came out very recently. If you want to see a terrifying depiction of what it means to come of age in this society, this is your movie. There's this one, which we're going to come back to, Nightmare on Elm Street. A generation of people grew up on this movie, including me. And there's Dawn of the Frickin' Dead. If you see one zombie film, this is the one you want to see. 1978, this movie's made. What did Romero show us with this movie? He showed us that you don't need a contagion or radiation or the rage virus to become a zombie. What you need is a shopping mall. That's it. That's what makes the change. These are the movies that I love. I am a horror fan. I have always loved horror. These movies scare me to death. But I will go back again and again with a big smile on my face, and I'll come out with an even bigger smile on my face. But there's a bit of a problem for me here, because you know what? I'm also a child psychiatrist. I mean, I have a bona fide MD, and I take care of children for a living. And not just the kids I'm raising, but the kids whose parents actually pay me, to see them. If you bring your kid to see a doctor, you do what everybody does nowadays. You Google their name, right? And in addition to being a child psychiatrist, I've written horror novels. I've written a couple of novels. I've written horror short stories. I've been involved in horror movies and video games. We even have a project right now where we're using virtual reality to create a wrap-around horror experience. So if you Google me and you say, this is the person I'm going to take my child to help, you might get that image, okay? That's actually an image from one of the books I wrote. And you know what happens? The kids, they say, yeah, it's a guy I want to see. But the parents, they don't do that. The parents say, I don't know. So if you're a child psychiatrist and you like horror, that Harvard name can only get you so far, okay? But I think because I'm a psychiatrist, I'm not so bothered by this. I'm actually sort of fascinated by my love of the macabre. I'm wondering, what is it about horror that we find so attractive, that those of us who are fans find so illuminating? How does horror teach us about ourselves? Is there something sneakily provocative about it? Why, when I was 13 years old, still with bangs, did my grandma Bobby give me that book? My sweet grandma Bobby for Hanukkah gives me this book. I asked for this book. That's why. I wanted to learn about this genre that I was so fascinated by. Is there something kind of sneakily profound buried in all the gore? And I'm going to say yes. That's the case I'm going to make for you today. I'm going to say that horror makes us ask questions that we are very uncomfortable asking in any other setting, except in the campy displacement that horror affords. And because of that, we can get to know ourselves better. We can tolerate our foibles better, and we can learn to love each other better. So let me give you some examples. I told you we're going to come back to this guy. That's Freddy Krueger from Nightmare on Elm Street. So I apologize for the spoiler alerts here. If you haven't seen this movie, And most people have seen this movie many times, or they're never going to see this movie. There's not a lot of in between on that one. But if you haven't seen it, I'm going to spoil a little bit of it. Freddy is a demon, okay? Now, those claws he has, those are like razor blades that he's fastened to these gloves, and he haunts teenagers in their dreams. So he gets into their dreams, and these kids go to sleep, and he slashes them in their dreams, and then they wake up, and they're still bleeding. In fact, if he catches you in your dream, you could bleed to death in real life. So what do the teenagers do? They refuse to go to sleep. Does that sound familiar to anybody? So the teenagers refuse to go to sleep in this town, and Freddy is a monster. He's a demon, and you hate Freddy for most of the movie. But around 3/4 into the movie, you learn Freddy's backstory. Freddy wasn't always a demon. Freddy was once a human being. He was a living, breathing soul, just like you and me. And he committed unthinkable acts in the very town that he now haunts. And he got caught, and he got tried, but he's released on a technicality. That's the words in the movie. So the town folk, before their kids are grown up, they take justice into their own hands, and they capture Freddy, and rather than giving him back to the authorities, they burn him alive. That's why his face looks like this. You don't see any of this in the movie. That's all the backstory. So now you've got a problem. I mean, Freddy's a monster. He's got to go. He's killing children in their dreams, children who they weren't even part of this mob justice thing, right? They're not responsible. And nevertheless, no one deserves to be burned alive. Everybody who went to that movie believed in due process. Everybody in the movie believes in due process. The whole movie's about due process, believe it or not. And yet, Freddy gets burned alive. So even if you don't believe in due process, does somebody really deserve that kind of ending? And before you know it, just like that, this trifling film, this throwaway, this thing that you rented probably because that face caught your attention, now you're thrust into this really interesting discussion of the ragged world of mob justice. And we can ask those questions much more easily in a horror film. I told you that that vampire was a brother, and I told you that we let that vampire into the house. So another spoiler alert here. I got to tell you a little bit about Salem's Lot. 2 brothers on their way home, sun's going down. They know they're not supposed to get home after sun goes down, and they know they're going to be late. So there is, of course, an obligatory shortcut through the woods. Every horror film has a shortcut through the woods, right? That's the way it works. So the big brother says to the little brother, come on, Dad's going to kill us if we don't get home on time. Let's take the shortcut through the woods. The little brother says, Dad's going to be really mad if we go through the woods. And the big brother says, kind of accurately, Dad will never know that we went through the woods. So let's just go. So the little brother sighs, follows. The big brother, because he's stronger, he can move all the brambles out of the way. And when he pops out, literally into his backyard, out of where the woods end, he notices that his brother's not with him anymore. He's lost his brother in the woods. So he doesn't think anything rotten's happened. He just is scared. So he goes inside and he says to his parents, look, we came home through the woods and I lost my little brother and I don't know where he is. And his parents are mad. So they send him upstairs onto that second story and they go out to look for him. And that's when that vampire shows up, who used to be his brother. In fact, that's why his brother didn't make it home. His brother got attacked by the vampire. When I was watching this movie, I wasn't thinking, don't let him in. I was thinking, he will definitely let him in because it's his brother, okay? And that blood bond of brotherhood transcends the fact that his brother is now a vampire. No, this may seem really silly and trite to you, except take away the word vampire and insert something new. I will not let my brother at the dinner table because he is a criminal. Or I will not let my brother at the dinner table because he's an addict. Or I won't have dinner with my brother because he didn't vote for the same guy I voted for. And if ever there were a timely debate that we can handle better in that campy displacement of horror, it happens in movies like this. And you might wonder, did I really get that when I was 11? Yeah. Not because I'm anything special. I work with 11-year-olds for a living, and I can tell you, they sense intuitively when there's a profound question on the table. They get it much better than adults. You know, the movie that did this best, Night of the Living Dead, 1968, $100,000 budget, not even copyright. I know George really well, George Romero, the guy who made this movie. He didn't know he'd be a filmmaker. He was, and I'm not making this up, the chief cameraman for Mr. Rogers when he made this film. So he chips in some of his own money. He gets his buddies to make this movie, and it takes the movie world by storm. And in one fell swoop, it attacks racism, it attacks sexism, it attacks a war that we as a nation couldn't seem to extract ourselves from. It asks us what we do in a postmodern world when science actually fails us, when we can't get the answers we need from science. And most importantly, it asks us what we do when fear overpowers our ability to be reasonable and how we can become violent. All that from a $100,000 non-copyrighted, he didn't know he'd be a filmmaker, so he never copyrighted it, non-copyrighted movie. That's a pretty impressive step if you think about it. So how does it do that? Let's move over to the brain, the organ I'm actually supposed to know something about, okay? Let's talk for a second about the tricks our brain play so that we can get to these fairly profound conclusions from horror films. And we do that through clowns. No, we don't really do that through clowns, but I showed you a picture of a clown here so you could engage in the first thing I want to talk about, a metacognition. So a metacognition means thinking about what you're thinking about. And in studies of people who like horror films, there's two really important findings. The first one is that they are frightened. So you know this by measuring things like skin conductance. You can see that people are sweating, respiratory rate, heartbeat. You know that you at least have a fight or flight response. And as those folks come out of the movie, you sort of say, okay, you had a fight or flight response, you did. What'd you think of the movie? And the first person who had the fight or flight response says, never again, never again. You say, okay, thank you for your time. But somebody else comes out and says, yeah, I was really scared, but that was really good. That was really good. And you say, well, what made it good? And then they stop and they say, that's a good question. I have to think about what made it good. I have to think about what I'm thinking. So clowns are the perfect example of that. Many people, even before all the nonsense that happened this fall, are afraid of clowns. Many people don't like clowns. No, but why don't we like clowns? That's a metacognitive exercise. So let's just do a little experiment here, a little thought experiment. A clown at the circus or at a birthday party or at a rodeo, that's okay, right? I mean, you might not like clowns, but you understand that's where he belongs. But a clown in your backyard holding a meat cleaver at 11:30 at night and staring, that's not right? That's a moment that doesn't fit the pattern. That's a metacognitive moment where you're saying, I know where clowns belong and it's not there, okay? That actually has to do with the second concept I want to talk about, and that's the concept of pattern recognition. You recognize the pattern of where a clown ought to be. So, another example. That's a pug. Everybody does that when I show that photo. Oh. So if you ask a 2-year-old, what is that? She'll say, that's a doggy. And you'll say, why is that a doggy? And she cocks her head kind of funny and like you're out of your mind. And she says, well, because it looks like a doggy. And if you say, well, how is a doggy different from a kitty? She's not going to say, well, kitties have retractable claws and those funky pupils. She'll just say, kitties look like kitties and doggies look like doggies. And can I go now? And you know what? She's right. She recognizes the pattern of a doggy. Pattern recognition sets in at a very young age. It's an adaptive response. It allows us to see when things are just slightly off and to take guard, to be aware, to know that things just aren't quite right. So we're going to do a little experiment with this very cute pug. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt him, I promise. We're just going to tweak this pug just a little bit. There. Okay? Now, you all laughed, right? You laughed because you recognized, before you understood why, the patterns here. Those are cat eyes on a pug. And you didn't say, I am laughing because those are kitty cat eyes on a pug's face. Your brain registered it as not quite fitting in, even before you knew why. You had to kick it north to that prefrontal cortex we heard about earlier in order for it to make sense. But you know what happens then? When we have that cognitive dissonance of two patterns that get shoved together and we feel a little bit frightened and we step away, you wonder, is that the source of prejudice? Is that the source of racism? Something that looks really similar to you, but it's a little bit different? Is that our neurobiological substrate for one of the worst things we can do as humans? These are the questions that horror can ask in ways that we cannot ask directly. We're a very funny species. We don't like difficult questions unless somebody poses it in displacement. And horror films give us that opportunity. It's a very subtle thing, horror. You might not know that. Horror is subtle, except when it's not. You guys remember this film? Oh my goodness. This movie, that's Alien. That's Ridley Scott's Alien. The tagline for this movie is, "In space, nobody can hear you scream." I tell you what, when I watched this movie, people heard me scream. Like the whole neighborhood heard me scream. Everybody up and down. When that thing busted out of that guy's gut, it was like, to quote the sequel to Aliens, it was game over, man. Game over. Bill Paxton just passed away. God rest his soul. But I don't remember being terrified. I remember laughing as I was screaming game over. And I remember laughing with my buddies because I didn't see Alien in the theater. I rented it. I was 17 years old then. My parents were not home. You guys are going to think I grew up with no one watching me ever. It was my parents weren't home. My sister wasn't there. I had all my friends over, and Mom, Dad, who are in the audience tonight, forgive me, we had procured some 3.2% alcohol beer, which was legal at the time in Kansas if you were 18. And in that funky kind of logic that adolescents like to engage in, I was not 18, but I figured because I had friends who were 18 were in the same class, I could drink of this beer. So we watched this movie and laughed and screamed in delight. And this is what horror does for you. It doesn't make you drink. That's not what I'm saying. It creates community. It creates connection. And that's the third part. It makes you think, it makes you recognize patterns, but it brings us together. And that's like gold to our social brains. We're wired to connect with each other. And we need ways to do that. Have you ever been to a horror film in the theater? Because if you haven't, you should. They play so much better in the theater. And it's the only movie setting where it is not only permissible, it is expected to yell, to scream, to say, "I can't watch," to shout instructions to the guy on the screen, to say, "What are you doing? Don't split up." And if you do split up, there's this dark, creepy tunnel that you just discovered. Don't go down there. And if you do go down there, why in God's name are you taking a match and not the flashlight that you had in your truck? This is what happens in horror. That happened in The Conjuring, if anybody saw it. That very scene, and everybody in the theater starts laughing. We love that moment. We know that the filmmaker loved the idea of the match and couldn't give it up. That connection. Horror is so derivative that you see every horror film and every other horror film, and you feel immediately like you're part of the club. Look, horror is a mirror, okay? It's a distorted mirror by definition. It's not what we think we're seeing when we look in it. But if it were super pristine, I don't think we could tolerate it because we got some ugly sides to us. But if we move it into displacement, we can ask some pretty provocative questions about ourselves, and we can answer them, learn to tolerate our vulnerabilities, our foibles, actually even learn to love ourselves more. That mirror can be a present to us. So go out and see the next horror film. Thanks for coming.
Well, that's good advice. And thank you for listening, rating, subscribing, telling your friends that it's good for you to watch horror films. And happy fucking spooky season. My emotionally intelligent, compassionate, horror-loving business goose. Good for you for being so self-aware. Tell your friends. Tell your friends you're not weird. And that it's not weird that Midsommar is your go-to film. Like any day of the week. Oh, no, wait, that's me. And a ghostly thanks to the folks over at Airwave Media, the podcast network to which WTI belongs. If you love this show, and you do, you love the other podcasts in this family. A brand new episode drops next week, and it's going to be on theme. And please, stay interesting.